Okay, guys, this is our beginning of the 1960s and Vietnam unit, and we're starting with Vietnam, even though it's kind of out of order in your textbook, um, because Vietnam colors everything else that happens in the 1960s. And if you're going to understand anything else that happens in the 60s, you got to understand Vietnam. So these first three slides will be about the Vietnam War, or the Vietnam conflict, as it never was officially a war. But we'll call it a war. Lots of fighting, lots of people die. Everybody else called it a war, so we're going to. We will begin Vietnam with absolutely nothing that has to do with the United States, but it does set the stage. We talked about this in our 50s unit, but just to do a quick little review, the colonial days of Vietnam for hundreds of years. Vietnam and this whole, if you look at the map there, this whole sort of Southeast Asia peninsula here is a colony of France. So for hundreds of years, Vietnam had been a colony of France. But as time goes on, as we get into the 1950s, an independence movement begins in Vietnam, led by Ho Chi Minh, Uncle Ho, as he is known. And Ho Chi Minh will lead the independence movement in Vietnam, lead the rebel fighters to overthrow the French. And they will finally drive the French out of Vietnam in 1954 at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. Dien Bien Phu. The French will lose a final decisive battle against the Vietnamese. Now, to kind of set this up, when Ho Chi Minh comes to power and declares Vietnam an independent country, he had appealed to the United States for help, going back to World War I, where we had proclaimed the end of sort of colonialism and so forth, imperialism. He calls us on it and says, "Hey, if you're truly all for imperialism, help us get rid of our imperial rulers." And when the United States refused to help Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam, they turned to Communist China. And again, if you notice on the map here, the northern border of Vietnam is China. So China was more than happy to help out Ho Chi Minh and Vietnam. We decided to back the French. No idea why, but we do, and it is a huge mistake because it turns Vietnam communist and against the United States. Okay? Now, after the French are driven out, there is a multinational conference held in Geneva in May of 1954. And at that conference, they decide that they're going to divide Vietnam into a north and a south along the 17th parallel. Okay? That is the little red dotted line you see here in the map. That will be the dividing line for Vietnam. North Vietnam will be communist, led by Ho Chi Minh, the man here on the Time magazine cover. South Vietnam will be a free democratic country led by a man named Ngo Dinh Diem. It's pronounced Go, even though it looks like Ngo. The N is silent. So Ngo Dinh Diem will lead South Vietnam, backed by the United States. Okay? Now, the deal was, at Geneva, they made a deal that within 2 years of the dividing of Vietnam, within 2 years, elections would be held, and the people of both countries, North and South, would hold elections to choose whether they wanted to be run by a communist government, like in North Vietnam, or a democratic government, like in South Vietnam. As time went on over those 2 years, it became more and more apparent that people would choose communism, like they had in North Vietnam. Therefore, the elections were never allowed to happen. The United States never allowed the elections to happen because we knew we were going to lose the elections. So we set up a dynamic where not only all of North Vietnam, but many of the people in South Vietnam dislike the United States. Okay? Now, this sets the stage for an event that will begin American military involvement. We already had lots of, well, how do I want to say this? We had lots of military already in South Vietnam to prop up Diem's government. Right? However, we hadn't been directly involved fighting North Vietnam. That changes in 1964, August 64, in the Gulf of Tonkin. Now, if you look at the map, you see the Gulf of Tonkin is right up here off China and North Vietnam. A United States ship named the Maddox, Maddox, the USS Maddox, Maddox, and it's the second time I've spelled it for you, so it should be a clue that that is going to be important. The USS Maddox was on patrol in the Gulf of Tonkin when it was attacked and fired on by North Vietnamese ships, supposedly. The USS Maddox fired back, and suddenly, with the attack on a U.S. ship, we are at war. Okay? As a result of the Maddox being attacked, Congress passes what's known as the Tonkin Gulf Resolution. Okay? And the Tonkin Gulf Resolution will give President Johnson, Lyndon Johnson is president at the time, this will give President Lyndon Johnson the authority to assist any country in Southeast Asia who was being jeopardized by communism. This is his justification for sending troops to South Vietnam to open hostilities against the North. Okay? The Tonkin Gulf Resolution, it's basically a blank check Congress hands the president to declare war on North Vietnam. Okay? Now, he never actually declared war on them, but we open hostilities against them. Okay? The thing is, the USS Maddox was never attacked. The captain thought he was under attack. He returned fire, but he never hit anything because there weren't any ships there. There was a radar glitch. He thought he was being surrounded. There weren't any ships there. He's firing at ghost ships, if you will. Whether we actually staged it or whether it was a genuine mistake, nobody's quite sure, but Johnson had been looking for a reason to get more involved, and this was it, the attack on the Maddox. Okay? Now, who are we fighting? Well, we're fighting a couple of groups. First group that we're fighting are known as the Viet Minh. Viet Minh. These are North Vietnamese soldiers. Right? This is the North Vietnamese Army. But the real problem is another group known as the Viet Cong, or the VC, or just the Cong sometimes. Sometimes they're even known as Charlie, because the military designation for the letter C, for Cong, the military designation for that is Charlie, Alpha Bravo Charlie. So sometimes the Viet Cong are known as Charlie. Now, who are the Viet Cong? They're our biggest problem. The Viet Cong are South Vietnamese who are loyal to the North. Okay? So these are South Vietnamese people loyal to the North. They're communist supporters. Okay? One of our biggest problems was the fact that unless you are in Saigon, which is right about here, unless you're in a big city like Saigon, the capital, you probably don't care about the U.S. You don't want the U.S. there. Most Vietnamese live in jungle villages. They don't know anything about communism. They don't know anything about democracy. They don't care about government. They just want to be left alone, and they know the U.S. is causing them problems. So our biggest problem in Vietnam was that most of the South Vietnamese people we're there helping don't want us there. And that's a problem. Okay? The Viet Cong are our real problems. They are South Vietnamese loyal to the North. Now, um, in March 1965, Johnson authorizes regular, full-scale bombing raids into North Vietnam. Okay? It is called Operation Rolling Thunder. These are regular, full-scale bombing raids into North Vietnam. They're not nuclear bombs, just heavy bombs here. But there you see the plane at the bottom and lots and lots of bombs. March 65, and one of the primary targets, not only in North Vietnam, are these black lines you see on the map. This is what's called the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Right? The Ho Chi Minh Trail. It's how supplies from the north got to the Viet Cong fighters in the south along this jungle trail. Sometimes it's only a few yards wide. It goes through the middle of mountains and jungles. But it was how the Viet Cong were resupplied, the Ho Chi Minh Trail. It was a major target of Operation Rolling Thunder. Right? Now, leading all this is the commanding officer in Vietnam, and that man is General William Westmoreland. And Westmoreland will be the commanding officer of all U.S. troops in Vietnam. Okay, so that's the beginnings and sets the stage for the rest of our tale.